Good afternoon, all. Yes, as I try to take a deep breath and convince myself not to be nervous in this presentation, I won't make any eye contact because that might distract me. So, yes. Thanks to the Black Lives Matter Committee for organizing this. This is very phenomenal. And thanks to Professor Michelle Johnson and the Harriet Tubman for supporting me as a student and supporting this conference. What I'll be presenting on this afternoon, it's on the program, biographies of West Africans from the era of the slave trade. This presentation will focus on biographies of West Africans in Sierra Leone in the 19th century. The time period that will be observed is the 1820s until the 1870s. Approximately 300 accounts have been assembled on the SHAD website, which form the basis of my study, or this study. The primary sources for the biographies derive from accounts that were written by missionaries and abolitionists, and which are culled from British colonial government documents and court proceedings. The study seeks to examine the identities of the writers of these biographies. Given the fact that some of these accounts were testimonies of individuals freed from slavery, but were written for them, the questions I want to ask include: who had the most influence and power in their compilation? Who was the teller of the story, and was the writer? Teller of the story and who was the writer? I pose these questions on the basis of the politics of the representation of identities in these documents. While attempting to interpret the meanings of these biographies, I also want to explore the identities of the individuals portrayed in the accounts. I will examine their struggles as enslaved peoples, as blacks, and as Africans. As far as possible, I want to analyze their social conditions. I want to isolate the biases of those who recorded the stories and whether or not abolitionists had the intent to represent Africans, enslaved or free, through the lenses of Eurocentrism. I have been involved in the transcription of many of these accounts from materials that have been collected in the SHAD project and which are now on the SHAD website, as I mentioned before. Transcribing these biographies and testimonies, it is possible to distinguish the styles of writings or how the accounts were presented. There are some that seem to have given close attention to the expression of the teller, and some that have been generated in less sensitive ways. For example, many of these accounts were generated for court and inventory records, where efficiency seems to have resulted in standardized testimonies. Examples of standardized biographies include court cases involving a group of enslaved Africans where the structure of the wording of the documents are the same, with the only differences being the names, sex, place of origin, and sometimes age. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. This one, name Jacob Brown or Mohamedou, sex male. Yet I didn't get any age from this account. But yes, Mohamedou, just reading what they have written about him. Mohamedou, alias Jacob Brown, was kidnapped while farming, sold to Damagaram, but ultimately reached the coast via or through Rabat and Ilorin, arriving in Sierra Leone in 1844. That's it. Another one, example, Sam Jackson, name Sam Jackson, or Habu, male, age of account 20 years old. Habu, or Sam Jackson, who was born in Kano but seized in raid by Gobir when he was 20, sometimes in the late 1840s, and sold to Lagos. This is how they worded their documents back then. Also, Mohamedou from Katsina, seized by Fulani while working on his farm, and then sold to Gobir, taken to Damagaram, and then sold south to Rabat and Ilorin before reaching the coast, probably at Lagos in the late 1840s. Other biographies gave more details of the experiences of West Africans both when they were in their homeland and after being being brought into captivity. Let me give you an example of this one. Name, Kalako, sex female, age of time of account 13 years old. Kalako, a girl about 13 years of age, states, I am a Timini who was brought here by some Mandigo people on the last rainy season and was delivered by them to Yeli Manja, already mentioned in number 3. That's the I think is another document that had an account on her, who about 1 month ago delivered me to the man mentioned in number 3, Muri Fude, and was carried off by that man to the same place as stated in number 3. I was delivered in charge of Madi Kaba, who kept me up to the night before last, when I was delivered to Kali Mordu, who delivered me up yesterday to the man of war people and brought over here by them. Again, that's how they wrote the testimonies. With regard to the agency of African peoples expressed through the biographies, I would argue that the authors did not intend to portray African resistance to slavery. Rather, the biographies examined proof to portray them as unassertive subjects. The documents were geared to specific political reasons. Abolitionists and the overall British's abolition agenda highlighted the deprivations of slavery to end the era of bondage. But consequently, the enslaved was often portrayed in the biographies as childish and dependent. While describing the conditions of slavery, the biographies created a general image of the enslaved incapable of outlining their own social state. With this representation, Africans, whether freed or enslaved, were always depicted as subjects to slavery, but also as desperately happy and grateful for any hope of freedom or social mobility given by British officials or abolitionists. Some biographies claim that some enslaved peoples saw their masters or former masters as fathers. Let me rephrase that. Some biographies show that some enslaved people saw their masters or former masters as fathers, thus always portrayed as grateful for their master's protection. A biography that I have examined called Honest Hosea constituted both the docile representation of an enslaved adolescent and the rosy picture of the relationship he had with his master and mistress. The letter was written in a response to his death from smallpox. I'll just read the letter here briefly. Poor Hosea had the misfortune to be sold as a slave when 8 years old. But he had the happiness, which thousands of countrymen never enjoy, to be redeemed from slavery and made a free boy. Through the liberality of the Church Missionary Society, which some years ago redeemed about 25 boys and girls from bondage and misery and placing them in settlement in the Rio Pongo for beneficial purposes. They were not actually free, they were given over to another slave master. The intent was to coin them as liberated Africans, but they were not actually liberated. Hosea was soon noticed to be a boy of singular character and of a degree of steadiness not much to be seen in boys of his age. His master thought, since he appears to be so steady, he may be honest and faithful too. He therefore placed him in a situation where Hosea had to become the servant of servants, to give to every one his meat in due season. Hosea, that was his Christian name, his simple yet troublesome work was to distribute the provisions of rice and other things to about souls in the settlement, with the buying in the smaller trade from the natives. In this situation, Hosea was about 6 years employed, and at the end of it, he was the same steady, honest, and faithful boy as at the beginning. Whatever he was told by his master or mistress, that would he do, not more or not less. It may be supposed that a boy to whom which is entrusted, especially where he is surrounded with heathens, that's other enslaved peoples, they call them heathen, surrounded with heathen when begging and stealing in no shame, is continually tempted by fear and sweet promises to give away and waste his master's property. Hosea was as hard as a diamond in all attempts, and could yield to none in giving attempts, and would yield to none, indeed, in giving a gram of rice more. Nor let or leave a tobacco go without the knowledge of his master. Of course, Hosea, as an honest boy, he had not many friends. He had not a good name either by the corrupted people that are the other enslaved Africans, either by the corrupted people in the settlement, nor by the native. But Hosea would not care for it at all. He knew no man after flesh to be faithful to his God, and his master gave him more pleasure than if all men had spoken well of him. The letter was written on behalf of the slave master, and after observing its intent, at first it wanted to give the impression of the mourning for the loss of the adolescent, but in fact, it was his servitude and loyalty to his master and mistress that seemed most important to the author. Throughout the document, the constant description of Hosea being honest and loyal in his enslavement, while at the same time being rigid with other blacks in the community, highlighted the author's depiction of what a good slave or Negro ought to be. Clearly, the writer of the letter intention was to undermine the harsh reality of the boy being enslaved. The author did not use the word slave to describe the adolescent. He used servant, but the psychology behind it was to depict the adolescent as favored by his master, undermining any notion of the adolescent or of the boy being abused. Stereotypes and representations of the submissiveness of blacks in biographical accounts were challenged by narratives from such authors as Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass. Scholars such as Crispin Sartrell describe other stereotypical production of enslaved blacks. Example, they were always depicted as illiterate, primitive, as well as with their country of origin were considered less civilized. They were portrayed as raw culturalist materials that were extracted from the all-natural and dark continent of Africa. Is that my time? Oh, okay.
It's also your time.
So set an alarm for me. Get him off. Okay. Sudan. All right. Yes. Many of the biographies consistently showed slave masters portraying themselves as Christians and protectors of childlike slaves, regarding themselves as keepers and carers of the enslaved. This purposely undermines the fact that under the law, captives were just mere properties and were at the mercy of the slave master. In order to prevent the reader from coming to a realization that slave masters had the power to be cruel and terrible to their slaves, the authors of many of these biographies presented the enslaved as childlike, suppressed the true expression of the teller, and gave them an appearance as simply happy servants. While the oppression of the captives is rendered invisible to the slave master, at the same time, the master is invisible to himself as the oppressor, which perpetuates the oppression itself. With this representation, contrasting the enslaved and master, black becomes white's other. Even though the authors in many cases did not explicitly or blatantly use racist descriptions in their writings, just the very notion of assigning certain standard contrasting characteristics to masters and their slaves highlighted the undertone comparison between blacks and whites. The captive is made to have no language, no culture, voice, or virtue than what was given by British Eurocentrism, thus imposing identities on enslaved Africans and also minimizing as much as possible their capabilities of owning their own identities. In conclusion, with observing most of these biographies, it has been uncovered that the writers of these documents reshaped and formed the expressions of these oral accounts. The Africans, which were supposedly the testimony givers, had very little choice or influence on how their voices have been heard. expressing their true feelings, their own identities, owning their identities, owning their agency, and having a fair representation when it came to the dialogue between the slave master and the enslaved. Most of these biographies hardly mention of the everyday struggles of the enslaved, which highlighted the censorship and suppression of the experiences of the teller of the story and their experiences in the harshness of slavery. The servitude of Christianity was used to paint over the oppressed anguish and yearning for freedom. The biographies presented conversions of blacks from their paganistic past to their new identities as Christians, which supposedly have made them very happy and comfortable to be enslaved to their Christian masters. The masters were often times presented as more civilized and Christian in relation to the enslaved. His ideologies and personalities were enforced upon the bodies of his slaves, and the authors of many of these biographies made this type of violence both invisible to the slave master and deserving to the enslaved. The master was invisible to himself as the oppressor, while the slave, their savagery, and their purpose as servants was made visible to them. These biographies, as far, number one, in most instances, were not clear on how these Africans viewed themselves through the political categorization of being black, and two, the African oral contributions were very limited in regards to describing and owning their own identities, where the undertones of white, thus resulting in the undertones of white control over the representations of blacks. The white representation in the biographies were louder than the voices of the enslaved.